Good morning.
Morning.
A number of years ago, a friend of mine who is also a Buddhist practitioner was diagnosed with an incurable cancer. And he started to talk about meaning. Okay, let's start again. A number of years ago, a friend of mine, who was also a Buddhist practitioner, was diagnosed with an incurable cancer, and he started to talk to me about meaning. And I've learned a few things from these interactions. One is that Buddhism doesn't seem to really explicitly talk about meaning. It's sort of, there's something implicit about it, but it's not explicitly addressed, and therefore he raised this question. It was unanswered for him. Another thing I learned is that the question of meaning, meaning of life, right, of a human existence, your human existence, is comes up with more intensity when the finiteness or finality of your life becomes more apparent. I mean, it's always there, but we forget about it. Don't take it so seriously. Oh, there'll be another day, there'll be another year, there'll be another decade. This is different for people who have gone through existential threats and crisis, and sometimes the feeling can be like, I'm on borrowed time, or I've got a second chance. This focuses us in a different way. And the other thing I learned is that questions of meaning are incredibly personal. They're not something that someone else can answer for you. They engage the uniqueness of our life. So here I am in this context of Buddhism, and I don't know, somehow I feel compelled to think with you about meaning, and but maybe Buddhism doesn't have any clear answers. Now, a note on the future of Buddhism. I don't know what it will be, what it can be. I don't think it will stay the same. It's never stayed the same. It is something different now in the West than it was in Asian cultures, or is in Asian cultures. And I don't feel competent to make predictions or even take a lead in something particularly, but I can feel certain tendencies, like sanghas are aging, the way Buddhism is presented is not as attractive now as it was in the 60s and 70s to many people. People are less idealistic about enlightenment. There were great hopes. Then you saw the so-called enlightened masters, mess up. And then you're like, well, maybe it's not that grand anyway. So things have happened that have changed the overall mental posture around Buddhism and how people are attracted to it. But still, I feel I'm practicing it because it has transformed my life. And so I'm sort of have this loose idea that Buddhism will be a collection of transformative methods. And transformation of self, culture, and society. And I hope that this collection of methods of transformation will be freed from the stupidity of being confined to, certain narrow traditions and schools. At the same time, there are difficulties in stepping away from traditions and schools. One is that the people who explore a certain set of methods deeply don't have time to explore other sets of methods deeply too, so they just pass on what they know intimately. And there's just a limitation of time and energy that one individual has. And it just means, I think it's useful to stay alert and open to kind of other methods, or what else is there, to not take on your tradition and your methods as some kind of truth with a capital T and become narrow-minded in that way. The other thing is what's hard about jettison traditions is I think transformation needs embodiment and intimacy. And one way to engage in training embodiment and intimacy is through ritual. And it's really difficult to invent meaningful ritual. So the kind of embodiment and intimacy that you have may be experienced through a certain kind of tradition, even though it's outmoded and a little bit, foreign and antiquated. It's sort of like valuable to keep it around, because if you get rid of it, then this important dimension starts to maybe, it's missing potentially. Okay, there's just some ideas. I think transformation starts with transformation of self, but it becomes a bit self-centered if it doesn't also take into account culture and society. However, we have a real problem now in our time and age. Like, any visions of transforming culture and society, I think, have become extremely suspect. I mean, you really want someone to tell you what the ideal culture and society is, and you feel like you can subscribe to that? We have rightfully become, I think, suspicious of any systems, because systems so easily become coercive, even if they're the most well-meaning. At the same time, we've now, I think, reached in our culture a level of atomization and fragmentation that starts to show that, without functioning systems and shared meanings, it's actually pretty impossible to maintain civilization. And it's like things will fall apart if those systems that we both take for granted and hate and find coercive, start to crumble. It's really frightening. So So we're stuck. On the one hand, we need systems to be able to live a shared civilized life, and at the same time, we don't want the confinement and the terror of, systems that start to, govern us in harmful ways. So I don't know. I don't think there's any clear answer. When I say I want to speak about meaning, meaning has more than one meaning. The word meaning has more than one meaning. The first meaning of meaning is some kind of the meaning of a word, or the meaning of a sentence, or the meaning of a text. That's not what I'm talking about, right? That would be an academic discipline like semantics or semiotics that deal with this kind of meaning. I'm talking about questions like, what makes life worth living? Or like in the case of my friend, did I do the right thing in my life? Did I meet my responsibilities fully enough? But also probably unanswerable questions that we still have as human beings. Like, why did it unfold just like that? How come I got involved with this partner and had children? And why did I put myself on this path, with this teacher and this tradition? Maybe these questions are unanswerable, but they're still kind of there. It's like there's a dimension, I think, in our life where we can feel into things like purpose and value and the significance of events. And this is what's covered by this term meaning, or the way I want to talk about it. Or the way I'm feeling about it right now. Reaching for words. There's a German public intellectual who fairly recently wrote a book called, I have to see how does the title translate. It would be like Obituary of Myself, or Obituary about Myself. An obituary of myself. And I haven't read the book, but I heard him speak about it on YouTube, It's where we get our information. Who reads books anymore? I do, occasionally. The idea is something like an obituary. Let's say it's not himself writing an obituary about himself, but someone else writing an obituary of him. It would be, what will I have done that is worth showing up in my obituary? That's a question of meaning. In a way, what's worthwhile doing, what is of value to others, what will be remembered about me, and so forth. But he took it to this other level of like, what if I was writing an obituary about myself now, imagining what I will have done when I die, and can I feel that will be in alignment with the deepest intentions that I have? So it's kind of an interesting exercise, right? It's like, because it makes you wonder, is like, is what I'm doing really what I really want to do? And are there options? What kind of transformation, what kind of shift would need to happen that I am more fully aligned with what really matters? Now, what really matters is, I'll get to this more later, is there is no objectivity about this. I mean, we sort of maybe desire some objective, universal answer about what matters. I don't think that exists. But there is something that we do each have a feeling about what matters. We may defend against it in a certain way because it would make a demand on us. But anyway, I think it's there in a certain dimension of our mind and influences us. Viktor Frankl, this Austrian psychotherapist who survived the concentration camps of Nazi Germany, he wrote this very well-known, influential book, Man in Search of Meaning, and has taught about meaning and constructed a therapy around meaning instead of, sexual desire, like Freud did, another Austrian. He says basically the core maxim of his approach to therapy is to live your life as if you're living it for a second time. In the awareness of what you've done wrong the first time you lived around, and noticing how you're about to make the same mistakes now that you did in your first life. And he says this is a good method to heighten our sense of responsibleness. I have worked for myself with the term responsibility, so we always are in situations of responding to the circumstances of our life. And we have that ability to respond, and from exercising this ability of responding in alignment with our deepest intentions, we fulfill our responsibility. I guess, like in the case of my friend who I led with, who feels the finiteness of his life under the impression of this diagnosis, there is this question of so now, what do I do with this limited time? How do I fulfill my responsibility as the ability to respond? So, we're all in this situation. Because although we forget, it is unclear how long we have to live. It could be a very short time, it could be a longer time. It doesn't really matter, because what we're pointed to, and this is very much an emphasis in Zen practice, right, is Meaning isn't something that is given to us as some kind of cosmic plan that we can just fit ourselves into. It emerges, Frankl points this out, it emerges from moment to moment in the interaction that we have with the circumstances of our life. And so according to him, it's like it is wrong to ask, what does life have in store for me? What can I get out of life to make my life more meaningful? This idea of self-actualization. It is better, he says, to ask, what is life asking of me? What is there for me to respond to meaningfully? If we do that, then a sense of self-actualization might be, an add-on that we get. Happiness would be that in that category too. You're not really able to make happiness happen. Happiness is kind of an accidental quality of responding to what life asks of you. Well, I want to tell you maybe a few stories in hope that you find a version of yourself in those stories. One story is like of my younger self. I felt a strong sense of a lack of clarity about what to do with my life, with the world, what was worth doing. And when you're a young person, you have to make decisions, like you go to a certain kind of school, or you train in particular skills, or you're looking for what kind of profession you want to have, and what people to engage with, and so forth. And underneath this, which is something that started in my teenage years, right? It's like there was a hope, pretty strong hope, desire, also kind of expectation that there would be answers, that it would be worthwhile, like reading books or listening to people, and find out about how to answer this. These kinds of questions. Religion, I don't know. I just dealt with religion because I was born into it. It's like Protestant Christianity, Lutheran, in Germany. It's like, which is, I think, just what happens. Like most of what we're dealing with, we're just kind of born into and osmotically take on mental postures, and then as we age, we just kind of have to come to terms with all these mental postures that we've taken on. It's kind of like, you don't get like a blank slate and then say like, oh, let me pick and choose. No, which is very obvious when you talk to Catholics. It's like, you can't undo Catholicism. It's like always a Catholic. It's just like, I say this, affectionately, and like you can only be a recovering Catholic. Yeah, you get into it, and then these mental postures are put on you, and then it's like, how can I get out of this? Not necessarily get out of it, or make it my own, or transform it, or make sense of it, all that. So my fantasy, which I didn't understand at the time, but now I look at it, my fantasy was there would be answers, there would be a system, there would be a rule book, There would be things that you're supposed to do, and I was so inclined to just follow those shoulds and fulfill them and make a good life out of this existence, like that. Now, you can do this in terms of religion, you can do this in terms of societal norms, you can do this in terms of cultural trends or whatever. So it's just like hoping that there's kind of a system that you can fit yourself in, and if you do, then things make sense and have meaning, and you have a place in that, and so forth. Well, it didn't work. This kind of stability or sense of security of following the shoulds never came. So I came to a point where I just wanted to throw it all away. It's like, crap. Academia, it's like, what is this? Like, it's not teaching me anything relevant. Which is, of course, not true, but, then you, maybe this, you could go into some kind of rebellion, But I learned later, in reflecting on this, that it's a kind of, I don't even have a word for this, it's a kind of parasitic rebellion. It's like you reject things, you think things are not good enough for me, these systems and so forth, while using them all the time to sustain your life. Some people don't become rebellious like this, but I did. And I just wanted to throw it all away and, not care about the practicalities of life. Which is a bit stupid. That's stupid, I don't know. Not sustainable. And underneath it is actually a kind of feeling of, if there isn't a given objective universal meaning that I can hook into, then there's no meaning at all. And then things don't really matter. And you're kind of free, and you're kind of free to just make something out of your life and whatever you want. This is, I think this is basically the pervasive situation of Western culture right now. It's like people who are still cling to sort of these systems of meanings and try to hold them up, even though they know it's just like we're just making it up, and other people are explicit about it and says like, well, you're just making it up. So then, well, what do we want to make up? Anything can be made up. Like Donald Trump, he can become president in some system, it's governed by a constitution, and then when he's president, he says, oh, let's just suspend this constitution. I'll just do what I want. This is nihilism. In terms of meaning, this is nihilism. There are no given meanings. They either don't exist, or if some meanings exist, they're just subjective, they're arbitrary, they're just made up. So you wrest some sort of subjective meaning from an overall meaninglessness, a universe that's just atoms and molecules, and how is there any meaning in an atom? I can't find anything. So, well, if there's any meaning, then humans are just putting it on top of a meaningless physical universe. And then, if you really believe that, well, then why should you go along with someone else's meaning? You just make up your own, and then you have a postmodern world in which everyone just like has their own meaning, or has a little subgroup of meaning, or people get so afraid of that they have to like cling to the old ways and say like, no, like we have to keep holding on to certain grand narratives like religion, or universal ideas of the Constitution or human rights. It's obvious that human rights don't apply everywhere, right? Like some nation states don't take them the way we like them to. It's like we just see the diversity. Okay, so I'm in this kind of nihilistic rebellion phase, I'd say, right? A certain romanticism goes along with it, just like, oh, I'm free, So in this freedom of throwing everything away, I went from Germany to America because it's like, well, just let's see what's happening somewhere else. And I stumbled into Zen practice, Buddhism, and something really profound happened for me. And it's still kind of difficult to say what it is, but I've spoken about it before. It's like I sat down, and pretty early on in just my sitting down, I had this very bodily feeling of feeling unapologetically alive, is the phrase that I've used for this. It's just like feeling an immediacy and presence of my own existence and aliveness. And it felt very indeterminate in the sense that it had no particular content, but it felt very solid at the same time. It's like, here I am. Now what? It cured my depression. It's depressing when you're a nihilist. It's totally depressing. It's so depressing. It's like, oh, nothing has meaning. I have to just, get a little bit somehow by making an effort. Gee. Why not kill yourself? That was just gone. It's like, wow, it's like you put your foot down and there's the ground and it feels like you feel supported and there's like blue sky and sun. And, when I ask myself, if I only have a week to live, like what would I do? Now, if I ask myself this question now, which I do now and then, it's like the first thing that I do is I just come back to the sensory aliveness of being in the world. Is like, oh, that's what mindfulness really is. It's like, feel your feet on the ground, drink a glass of drink water, and then, man, that's really delicious. It's fresh, it's cool, it's life-sustaining, makes your mouth wet. Jeez, it's just the best thing in the world. I feel that way about if I'm in that frame of mind, I feel that way about accounting. It's like, oh, here's this receipt, it goes into that category. It's like you order things, you make it work, you have, and then you get a grasp on your finances. How delicious is that? It's fantastic. I'm not kidding. That's how I feel. If I see it as a chore, it's like, oh God, I have to come. That's gone. If you see it as an expression of aliveness, it's like I get this opportunity to do something, it feels meaningful and actually quite enjoyable, Columns of numbers that add up to zero. Wait, man, it's like a glass of water. Now, this experience of unapologetic aliveness is a non-verbal experience, was a non-verbal experience for me. It's just awareness and bodily energy, all packed into this here now moment. You don't get a life from that. I mean, a life in terms of like what to do, you just get a yes to existence, which is a lot. Now, Zen practice for me was always, investigating the mind and its verbose qualities. Like I usually call it discursive thinking. It's like, discursive thinking floating around in your meditation, narratives, fragments of narratives really, wondering what to do, regrets about what you have done, memories, like traumatic events that you can't seem to shed, that keep floating around, and all of that. I could endlessly describe, all these verbal qualities and imaginal qualities of the mind. So when we practice meditation and notice that discursiveness and return to the breath, and return to the breath, and return to the breath, and return to body sensations and posture, we're learning to not be identified with this discursive contents of the mind. And so I was engaged in this practice for decades. So sometime years into doing this practice, I had this experience actually doing walking meditation, doing a sesshin, and I've mentioned this before. It's like I had a moment where all meaning drained out of the world. That's the way it felt. It's like I was looking at the world, everything was just blank. It's like there are no words that sort of attached to objects. Like, yeah, you could attach a word, but you could attach all kinds of words, or no word, and there was also a blankness of any kind of orientation. I called this experience bad emptiness. I don't know if that's an accurate description, but that's how I called it. It's like, oh, that's emptiness, but feels kind of bad. This was for me an embodied experience of nihilism. Nothing is meaningful, nothing has semantic meaning that can be stabilized in any way, and even the whole visual quality of the scene, or the sensory appearance, is like, it was just like a weird flat dream or something, grayish dream. I think it's some kind of detachment disorder or derealization or something experience. Could be a bit frightening. I wasn't frightened. I was just like, ooh. Is this enlightenment? I hope not. A fellow practitioner told me about an enlightenment experience he had, or he thought he had. He was also walking. He was also walking along, and he had this feeling like everything was just coming together swimmingly. The whole universe was in communion, and, everything was, the feeling was like everything's just going my way. All my problems are solved. I'm here, I feel light and relieved, and, everything will unfold in a way that's just, fitting for me personally, like that. And then as he's walking along with that kind of feeling, which I think is really powerful, he stubbed his toe on a rock. And it all collapsed. And he's like, oh shit. Now I have to deal with this. I found this story extremely interesting because I think that's everybody's fantasy of enlightenment, actually. Not everybody's. I'm just saying, if you have a fantasy about enlightenment that is the solution to your... It is actually that fantasy. And I think what's so interesting about it is like, it can be real. The mind can actually produce that state. And maybe, I have very few experiences with, almost no experience with drugs, but I had good friends who were, using cocaine. And sometimes I think, that thing is like, I'm just on top of the world, everything is just coming my way, the way I want, I'm all powerful. It's like as if you're on cocaine. Maybe you become a little bit more aggressive than my friend was when you're on cocaine, but it starts to become kind of aggressive. It's like, whatever, and I think, anyway. Geez, I'm just telling stories and weird things, and it's like, okay. To wrap this up, get some kind of message together. Meaning is what we're talking about. Buddhism has this teaching of the middle way. In the sutras, originally the middle way is something like steer clear of the extremes of indulgence and asceticism. Don't indulge in sense pleasures, that's not making a good life, and also don't deny yourself the nourishment of, asceticism, so avoid those extremes. But there's also the middle way between the extreme views of eternalism and nihilism, as it's called. Eternalism would be what I just said. If we apply it to meaning, it would be something like there's an objective, universal truth with a capital T that is out there, a rule book of ethics that you just have to adopt. And if you do, you are in alignment with God, the cosmos, pure reason, the truth with a capital T, and that's how to orient your life. And one version of that is basically my friend's experience of like the self merges with the universe, and basically nobody says this in this pop spirituality and versions of Advaita, Vedanta, and whatever's out there. All this is a conglomerate of like basically I am God. And this true self that is actually like God is unassailable. And if you hook up with that, you're good. Until you stub your toe. Or something worse than stubbing your toe. Some meaningless event happens that somehow shakes your confidence in the cosmic plan. That you are actually owning as God. That would be an eternalist view. And a nihilistic view would be nothing matters. Meanings don't exist. And if they exist, they're only subjective. And if they're only subjective, then actually it's as if they don't exist because there's nothing shared about them. And then we're all lost as individuals in a kind of free-floating meaninglessness. This is postmodernity. And Buddhism says, steer clear of these two extremes. Now, I think what happens when you try to steer clear of these two extremes, you're actually constantly flip-flopping between them as a first approximation of steering clear. Right? It's like when you recognize, like I did as a younger person, that I'm stuck in this idea of like trying to fit myself into a master plan and it doesn't work, then you flip-flop and say, well, if there isn't a grand narrative of meaning, or if there isn't this like cosmic plan, then it must all be meaningless. But when you arrive at it's all meaningless, this is not a life you want to live. So then you're hoping, and this is why I think people like me become spiritual, then you're hoping for getting the eternalistic, approach. You're hoping to get it through some kind of modernized spirituality that isn't just like stupid Christianity, but some more sophisticated way of dealing with God and the true self, and then you end up on that side again until you stub your toe. Both these stances, eternalism and nihilism, if you see them as versions of each other, actually have a truth. It's like the attraction of nihilism is to say, like, this overarching universal meaning truly doesn't exist. This is what's true about nihilism. And what's true about eternalism is that nihilism can't be correct. There is actually meaning. It just doesn't. So then you come back with nihilism. It just doesn't exist in this universal, objective way. All-encompassing. So steering clear, and this is Buddhist emptiness, steering clear of these two extremes is actually deeply acknowledging and appreciating the vagueness of our life, the ambiguity of our life, everything that cannot be pinned down, the changeability of everything, the groundlessness, that you can't land anywhere, that you can't make yourself a secure nest of meaning or identity and purpose, a set of values, a rule book of ethics. All of this is actually not available. It's not guaranteed by God. It's not guaranteed by smart people. Let me just find somebody who can explain it. But it's also not true that just because that universal meaning doesn't exist, that life is meaningless. Meaning appears as an interaction, situational interaction with the circumstances of your life. Which, like, what we want to cultivate is an openness, like Frankl says, to respond to what the circumstances of our life ask of us. And this is great because we are different people. We are unique in that, like, nobody shares your circumstances, your specific circumstances. Like, we have all different patterns on our fingers. It's kind of amazing. But if you extrapolate this, it's like we have all different patterns of the circumstances in our personality and how we interact with it. So how we take that on is actually our unique life that fills with meaning as we're taking that on. So when I remember sitting with this, what I called unapologetic aliveness, if I feel more deeply into this, not just as a cure for depression, but if I feel into this more deeply, it's like there's this quality of openness and willingness to respond and be engaged. Rather, depression is something like, I'm not talking about all kinds of depression, but this sort of, not maybe clinically depressed, but this depression can have this feeling of like, I'm not really willing to take on the difficulty of the circumstances of my life, and I feel actually more comfortable being confined in this box of just enough apathy. And then meaning doesn't arise. Meaning doesn't actually appear. It's like the willingness to come out of that box and engage with the circumstances is like demands of you to say like, well, what does matter? What is important to me? For what do I have a shred of passion? So in this still sitting, this existential aliveness and this openness is a way of engaging without ever trying to fixate on anything as the permanent solution for something, you know. There's a kind of openness and fluidity and willingness to change, and at the same time you engage with the patterns and circumstances of your everyday life. Not trying to get over it or transcend it into some other, spiritual godlike realm. So, if you have one day or 1 week or let's say a year to live, what are you going to do? What makes sense? Don't think about it. Don't try to answer it abstractly. It's like you're not going to get an answer. Just yesterday, somebody asked, will you write me a letter of recommendation? I want to apply for this job. And I'm like, yes, I will do that. There's meaning. Somebody thinks I can write a letter of recommendation. My life has value in that moment, right? But if you just look at and then, that's a funny no. But if you add all these moments of responsiveness, something emerges from that. Thank you very much.